All right, everybody, buckle up because today we are diving headfirst into the amazing world of the human brain with Dr. Clarkson's survey of neuroanatomy appendix.
Yeah, I have to admit, this appendix, it's not light reading.
No kidding. It's incredible, though, right? Like just skimming through it made my head spin a little. Did you know that our brains, even though they're only like 2% of our body weight, they use up a whopping 20% of our daily energy?
It's true. It really shows you how much work is going on up there constantly. And that whole myth about only using 10% of our brains, forget about it. Your brain is like a high-performance engine even when you're sleeping, consolidating memories, regulating your body, the whole 9 yards.
Speaking of myths, I loved that little tidbit Dr. Clarkson threw in about how alcohol doesn't actually kill brain cells.
Right. He definitely doesn't shy away from those common misconceptions.
Hmm.
But it's a great opportunity to clarify, what alcohol actually does is mess with how our brain cells communicate.
Okay, so before we get too deep into that, we got to start with the basics. Dr. Clarkson doesn't hold back on the neuroanatomy jargon, does he?
Nope, not at all. But once you get a handle on the terminology, it's like you've got this secret decoder ring for the brain.
A secret decoder ring. I like that. Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, imagine holding a brain in your hand. It's not a perfect sphere, right? So instead of your typical north, south, east, west, neuroscientists use terms like rostral for the front caudal, for the back dorsal for the top, and ventral for the bottom.
So it's a whole new language for navigating this amazing organ?
Exactly. And to make it even more interesting, to understand how different parts connect, we got to visualize these layers, like slicing a cake.
Okay, I think I can picture that.
Neuroscientists use sagittal, like cutting a loaf of bread lengthwise for a side view, then coronal, slicing bread for a front view, and then there's transverse, which is like slicing a layer cake top down.
So it's like looking at a map from different angles, right, to really get a sense of the terrain. And speaking of terrain, what about all this talk about gray matter versus white matter? It's like we're dividing the brain up into shades of gray now.
Well, not exactly about shades, but you're right, different types of brain tissue. Think of gray matter as the brain's processing centers, where all the action happens. Neuron cell bodies, dendrites, synapses, all crammed in there.
And that forms the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, right? The wrinkly part we always picture.
You got it. And those wrinkles, or giri and sulci as Dr. Clarkson calls them, those are crucial for our brain power. More wrinkles mean more surface area, which means more processing power.
So a wrinkly brain is a good thing. I've always wondered about those wrinkles.
It's like folding a giant map to fit it in your pocket. You're not
Mm.
losing any information, just making it more compact.
Okay, so we've got our directions sorted, our gray matter from our white matter, and a newfound appreciation for a good wrinkly brain. What's next on our neuroanatomy adventure?
Now that we've gotten the lay of the land, it's time to meet the superstars of your brain, the ones calling the shots, the lobes.
The lobes. Okay, lay it on me. What's the first stop on our tour of the brain's superstars?
Well, we've got to start with the head honcho, the frontal lobe, right?
Right,
The CEO of your brain.
the frontal lobe, right. Dr. Clarkson calls it the control panel for personality and communication. So basically, what makes us us?
Exactly. It's where all those higher level thinking skills come into play, like planning, decision making, problem solving. And it's not just about thinking, it's also about managing your emotions, inhibiting those impulsive urges. Like when you really want to tell someone off, but your frontal lobe steps in like, hold on a sec.
It's like our inner voice of reason.
Exactly. And this inner voice, it doesn't fully mature until adulthood, which, as Dr. Clarkson points out, probably explains a lot about those teenage years.
Oh, absolutely. And within this frontal lobe, there's an area called the prefrontal cortex.
Right, the prefrontal cortex, it's like the CEO's right-hand person, in charge of all those executive functions we were just talking about. And it's fascinating, actually, because one of the things that really helped us understand just how important the prefrontal cortex is was a rather unfortunate incident involving a guy named Phineas Gage.
Oh, yeah, Phineas Gage. Now that's a story. One and a half, a tamping iron through the skull, if I remember correctly.
You remember correctly. And get this, he survived,
Mm.
but his personality, it totally changed.
Yeah, it was like he became a different person, right?
Absolutely. He went from being this really responsible, well-respected guy to being impulsive, disrespectful, couldn't hold down a job, and it all traced back to the damage to his prefrontal cortex. Really highlights how delicate that balance is up there.
It really does. Okay, so that's the frontal lobe, our brain's executive suite. What about the parietal lobe? What's its claim to fame?
Well, think about all the amazing things your senses allow you to experience. The feeling of a warm blanket, a delicious meal, the sound of your favorite music. All that sensory information gets integrated in the parietal lobe. It helps us understand our body and space, too, where we are in relation to the things around us.
So it's like our brain's sensory processing center, taking in all that information from the outside world.
Exactly. And let's not forget the occipital lobe, or as Dr. Clarkson so aptly puts it, the eyes in the back of your head.
Right. The occipital lobe, all about vision.
Everything you see, from the words on this page to the faces of your loved ones, it all gets processed back there in the occipital lobe.
It's amazing how specialized each area of the brain is. And speaking of specialization, we can't forget about the temporal lobe memories, right? Especially musical ones.
You got it. The temporal lobe is crucial for processing auditory information, understanding language, and forming those long-term memories that shape who we are. It's no coincidence that it's located right next to our ears.
Makes sense to me. Now, Dr. Clarkson also mentions a couple other areas that I have to admit I'm pretty curious about. What about the insular cortex?
Ah, the insular cortex. It's like this hidden island tucked away deep inside the folds of the brain.
And it's involved in things like self-awareness and empathy, right? And what were the special neurons he talked about? VNs?
Yes, the von Economo neurons, or VENs. They're these large, spindle-shaped neurons that we find in the insular cortex and a few other areas. And here's the thing. We've only found them in species with complex social structures, like great apes and humans.
So it's like these VNs might actually be part of what makes us uniquely human.
That's one of the leading theories, and it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. We're only just scratching the surface of understanding their role in social cognition, empathy, things like that. It's a whole other layer of the brain's complexity.
It's incredible how much is going on in there that we're totally unaware of. And speaking of complex processes, how do all these different areas work together? Especially when it comes to something like movement, it seems like there must be a lot of coordination happening.
You're absolutely right. It's like an orchestra, with each area of the brain playing its part in this beautiful symphony of movement.
An orchestra in our heads. I love that analogy. So who's the conductor of this intricate symphony of movement?
Well, you can think of the motor association area as the composer, coming up with the idea, the intention to move.
Okay, so the intention to move, that's the first step. Then what?
The motor association area sends that intention over to the primary motor cortex, which is like the conductor. This is where the intention gets translated into action.
So the primary motor cortex is calling the shots, telling the muscles what to do.
Exactly. It sends signals down the spinal cord, like a conductor cueing the different sections of the orchestra. And those signals ultimately reach the muscles, telling them to contract or relax.
And how does the brain know which muscles to activate? It seems like it would be easy to get things mixed up.
That's where things get really interesting. Inside the primary motor cortex, there's this amazing map called the motor homunculus. Imagine a distorted human figure projected onto the brain, where the size of each body part reflects how much brain power is dedicated to controlling its movement.
So parts of the body that require really fine motor control, like our hands, would have a much larger representation on this homunculus map.
Exactly. That's why we humans, with our incredible dexterity, have such a disproportionately large area in the motor cortex dedicated to our hands. It's all about prioritizing those fine motor skills.
So clear. Okay, here's a question that's always boggled my mind. If I want to move my right arm, the command originates on the left side of my brain, right? How does that work? It seems counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, but that's just how our brains are wired. It's called contralateral control, and it all comes down to how those signals travel down the spinal cord. They actually cross over at a point called the decussation of the pyramids.
Decussation of the pyramid, it sounds almost mythical.
It does, doesn't it? But it's just another example of the amazing complexity of the nervous system. So, signals from the left side of the brain control the right side of the body and vice versa.
Wow, our brains are so weird and amazing. Speaking of amazing, Dr. Clarkson also mentioned that case of Anatoly Bugorsky in this appendix. A particle accelerator beam straight through the brain, and he survived. It's unbelievable.
I know. It's a story that really highlights both the vulnerability and the incredible resilience of the brain.
It really does. Okay, so we've covered how the brain sends signals out to control movement, but what about the flip side? How does the outside world get inside our heads? How do we sense things like touch or temperature or pain?
Just like with motor pathways, there are dedicated sensory pathways that carry information from our sense organs to our brain. It's like a relay race, with information being passed along a chain of neurons.
A relay race for sensory information. Tell me more about how that works.
So you've got your first-order neuron, which picks up the signal from the body, like, say, from your skin if you touch something. That first-order neuron carries the signal to the spinal cord.
Okay, so the signal gets to the spinal cord, then what?
That's the second-order neuron steps in. It picks up the signal in the spinal cord and carries it up to the thalamus, which is deep inside the brain.
The thalamus. That name rings a bell.
The thalamus is like the grand central station for sensory information. It receives input from all the senses, except smell, and directs that information to the appropriate areas of the cortex.
So it's like the brain's sensory switchboard, making sure all the incoming information gets routed to the right place.
Exactly. And then you got your third-order neuron, which takes the message from the thalamus to the appropriate sensory cortex, where it's finally processed and you become aware of the sensation, whether it's a gentle touch or a sharp pain.
So it's a whole journey for sensory information to travel from the body to the brain.
It is, and it happens in a fraction of a second, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. And within those sensory pathways, you've got specialized neurons and receptors that are fine-tuned to detect specific types of stimuli. Dr. Clarkson goes into quite a bit of detail about the different types of touch receptors, for example, and how they allow us to distinguish between different textures and pressures.
It's amazing how much we take our senses for granted until we really stop to think about how they work. And speaking of amazing sensory experiences, what about pain? That's got to be one of the most, well, memorable sensory experiences we have.
Pain is definitely an attention grabber. And Dr. Clarkson dedicates a good chunk of this appendix to explaining the complexities of pain perception, even delving into the different layers of the spinal cord known as Rex's laminae that are involved in transmitting and modulating pain signals.
Rex's laminae. Now that's a mouthful. And wasn't there one layer in particular that caught your eye? Lamina the second, right?
Yes, lamina second, also known as the substantia gelatinosa. It's like a gatekeeper for pain signals.
A gatekeeper. That's an interesting way to think about it. How does it work?
Well, imagine you touch something hot. You automatically pull your hand away before you even consciously register the pain.
Right. It's a reflex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's because pain signals actually travel to the brain through two pathways, one fast and one slow. The fast pathway is what triggers that immediate reflex, while the slow pathway, which involves lamina the second, is what gives you that lingering burning sensation.
So lamina second is responsible for that throbbing pain that makes you want to stick your hand in ice water.
Pretty much. And what's even more interesting is that lamina second doesn't just transmit pain signals, it can also modulate them, which means it can either amplify or dampen down the signals depending on various factors.
So it's like a volume knob for pain. And this is all happening in the spinal cord before the signals even reach the brain. That's incredible. This is all so incredibly complex, and we haven't even touched on the cerebellum yet. I know it's often associated with balance and coordination, but it sounds like there's a lot more to the story.
You're right, there's a lot more to the cerebellum than meets the eye. While it's definitely involved in motor control, recent research has shown that it's also involved in a much wider range of cognitive functions than we previously thought. Things like language processing, attention, even social cognition.
Wow, the cerebellum is like a jack of all trades. What a fascinating area of the brain.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the more we learn about it, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Every new discovery leads to more questions and more mysteries to unravel.
Exactly. And that's what makes neuroscience so exciting. It's a constantly evolving field with new discoveries happening all the time.
Well, I have to say, this has been a pretty mind-blowing deep dive into the world of neuroanatomy. From those energy-guzzling lobes to those super-fast sensory pathways, our brains are truly marvels of nature.
They absolutely are. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore, from the intricate workings of neurons and synapses to the mysteries of consciousness and perception.
And who knows what new discoveries await us just around the corner. If you're as fascinated by the brain as we are, be sure to check out Dr. Clarkson's Survey of Neuroanatomy. It's a challenging read, but it's well worth the effort. And be sure to join us next time as we continue our exploration of the amazing world of the human brain.